Let's talk about natural selection. Here are our learning goals. We're going to describe Lamarck's theory of evolution, we're going to describe Darwin's theory of natural selection, and we're going to use the terms genetic variation, overproduction, competition, and reproduction of the most fit. Now, evolution was something that scientists had realized had happened for hundreds of years before Darwin and Lamarck came along. They knew that if you go back in time in the geologic record, that the fossils that were preserved in rocks became more and more primitive the further back in time you went. Scientists sought to explain how life could become more complex over time. Now, many theories were developed about evolution. In fact, Darwin's own grandfather developed a theory of evolution long before Darwin did. One scientist who came up with a theory of evolution was called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He believed that living things could acquire traits during their lifetime and pass those traits on to their offspring. And this is how he thought it worked. There's an animal in Africa that looks sort of like a giraffe but has a much shorter neck. Lamarck believed that an animal with a short neck could enlarge their neck or lengthen their neck by constantly stretching and reaching to reach leaves high up in the trees. And that this long neck that they developed in their lifetime could be passed on to their offspring. Now, we know that this isn't true. Genetics tells us that you cannot acquire a trait in your lifetime and then pass it on to your offspring. It just doesn't work that way. So the hallmark of his theory is that if you needed a trait to survive, you would acquire that trait, and then you would pass it on to your offspring. In the early 1800s, the Royal Navy in England decided to send out a ship on an expedition of discovery. It would go completely around the world, and it would make accurate charts for the Navy. They realized that this ship would be visiting places where scientists had rarely, if ever, gone before. So they wanted a scientist to go along on this voyage. Darwin was the scientist that got the job. And at 22, he sailed around the world on the HMS Beagle. And this is a replica of what the Beagle would have looked like. At that time, sailing completely around the world was a huge adventure. Very few people had ever done anything like that before. Darwin collected lots and lots of specimens on this trip around the world. He collected living things, he collected fossils, rocks, all kinds of specimens. Among the things that Darwin noticed was that there were differences between organisms on the mainland of South America and islands that he visited off of South America. In particular, he was struck by the diversity of life on the Galapagos Islands, which are located in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Ecuador. There are a variety of organisms that live on these isolated islands that are different from organisms anywhere else in the world. The other thing that he noticed was that there were differences between organisms that lived on the various islands in the group. In particular, he noticed that there were a group of small birds called finches who were all very similar in their body shape, but they had adapted to different ways of life and developed different shapes of beaks depending on the food that they ate. He found that the islands contained 13 different species of these finches. He wondered why there were so many types and how did they get there in the first place. Well, it turns out that all of these finches are related to this bird that lives in Ecuador in South America. What Darwin believed happened was that, possibly due to a storm, these birds were migrating and blown off course out over the ocean and just by happenstance managed to land on these islands. Then over the years, as these birds exploited different food sources on the islands, they developed different shaped beaks that made it possible for them to eat foods that the other finches couldn't eat. Darwin came up with his theory of natural selection, and he thought it worked like this. First of all, let's go back and think about these giraffe-like animals in Africa as an example. Here's one of these animals that has a relatively short neck. When it has offspring, these offspring are not all going to be the same. Some are going to have slightly shorter necks, some are going to have slightly longer necks. When these animals compete for food, the ones whose necks are slightly longer are going to have an advantage. They're more likely to survive, and they're more likely to reproduce and produce their offspring. They're going to pass this trait for a slightly longer neck on to their offspring. When these offspring compete for food, they're going to be more successful. They're going to produce more offspring. And their offspring, some of them will have slightly longer necks than others. And eventually, repeating this over and over again, over many generations, you'll end up with all the animals having long necks. So here are the principal ideas behind natural selection. First of all, more offspring can be produced than can survive. Think about rabbits. If you have 2 rabbits and they reproduce, and all their offspring survive and reproduce, within a few generations, rabbits would literally cover the earth. But that doesn't happen because there's not enough food, shelter, and so forth for all the rabbits to survive. There's genetic variation between offspring, right? You can look around at your own family. Your brothers and sisters aren't exactly like you. There's variations. You might be a little taller than your brother or sister. One of your brothers or sisters might be stronger than you are. So there's individual differences between offspring. There'll be competition between individuals for limited resources. So we have more offspring that are produced than can survive. There are individual differences between the offspring. These offspring are going to compete for limited resources. Some offspring are going to be more successful because of their individual differences. Those that are more able to survive are more likely to reproduce and pass on their genes to their offspring. Those are the basic ideas that underline natural selection. We can compare these ideas about natural selection to what happens every spring when boys try out for the Mount Vernon soccer team. Think about it. One year, 150 guys tried out for our team. Now, 150 guys are not going to make the soccer team. So that's kind of like more offspring being produced than can survive. Not all the soccer players who tried out have the same skill level. Some are really good, some are kind of mediocre, and some weren't very good at all. That's kind of like genetic variation between offspring. And all these guys competed for a spot on the team. But there's only a few spots on the team. There's a limited number of spots, so not everybody could make it. Those that had the most talent were able to compete successfully and win a spot on the team. It's not exactly like natural selection, but it's similar. So let's compare Darwin and Lamarck. Darwin says that reproduction produces variation among individuals. There are more individuals produced than can survive. Those individuals are going to compete for scarce resources. The individuals that are best able to compete are more likely to reproduce and reproduce more offspring. They're going to pass on the genes that help them reproduce or to survive and reproduce, and those genes will be found in their offspring. Lamarck believed that if you needed a trait, you would develop the trait through your activities during your lifetime. You would acquire a trait through your activities, and you would pass that trait on to your offspring. We know that Lamarck is wrong. We know from modern genetics that we inherit traits from our parents, We don't develop the traits on our own. So let's compare Darwin and Lamarck. Darwin says that change is based on random genetics. Organisms are born different from each other. Lamarck says that change is based on what you need. If you need a trait, you'll acquire a trait. Darwin says the source of variation is just random mutation and genetic recombination through sexual reproduction. Lamarck says the source of variation is that organisms acquire traits they need in their lifetime. Darwin says that evolution doesn't happen according to any plan. It's random. Lamarck says that evolution unfolds according to a plan. So here are some ideas that you should keep in mind about evolution. Organisms are born with a random combination of genes. Sometimes those genes are helpful and help you survive, and if they do, you're more likely to reproduce and pass those genes on to your offspring. Sometimes that random combination of genes is not helpful, and if it isn't, then it doesn't help you survive. Evolution doesn't have a goal. It's not like every frog wants to evolve into a fish and then into a person, right? There is no goal in evolution. It's totally random. The genetic variation among individuals is very important for evolution. It's the raw material of evolution. And sexual reproduction creates unique combinations of genes and ensures that there's going to be genetic variation and genetic diversity within a population. The more genetic diversity there is in a population, the greater the odds are that that species is going to survive and reproduce and be successful. When you think of evolution, you should think of a game of Monopoly. In Monopoly, the players have their money, they play the game, and somebody gradually builds up more and more money and gradually wins. That's how evolution works. It's not like a boxing match where two species fight it out and one species eliminates the other in a short period of time. Evolution occurs over long periods of time. Small changes slowly build up, and eventually one species will replace another.